Hello and welcome back to Parley, the show where you folks support the other stuff I make by paying me monthly to talk about the topic for your choice, make it into a sort of custom podcast. This month, EyePatchNotes has chosen anime openings. My thesis for this parlay is going to be anime openings as entire anime. We talked about this in previous parlay related to anime and anime openings, and I said that I think one nice thing anime openings can do is they can be kind of like a snapshot into the daily life of that world and set sort of a mood for parts of a show that they're relevant to the story, but we're not going to focus on those things. A show that is mostly action or like on plot task, not very slice of lifey. But then maybe the opening showcases what those characters do in their day-to-day life. I think that's quite common with endings as well. The animation showcases a really common ending theme gimmick is to have the characters like getting ready for the day or something, which we will never see or will only rarely see in passing during the actual show, but it helps set some ambiance for the show. I think that's really clever. I think that's a good technique. EyePatchNotes here is asking about kind of another thing you can do with an anime opening, I think equally important and much more often done poorly, which is basically introducing the characters and suggesting the structure of the show. Kind of like a table of contents, but really, really bad and spoilerific most of the time, which I think table of contents in like a book I don't think those fail at that quite as frequently. So anyway, a really interesting topic. Let me start. EyePatchNotes says, I request a discussion on narrative density through visuals. Anime openings can be said to be dual purpose, gently allowing everyone to get situated for live broadcasts and to reinforce the show's contents. Totally. The directory-creatory people thus have about 90 seconds, the average anime opening length, to encourage viewers to stick around. More upbeat or hot-blooded openings may also build some hype. Putting aside the misuse of spoilers, that is, like showing information in the opening that is literally a spoiler for the show. If you're not someone who watches a lot of anime, think like movie trailers too often make this mistake. They're kind of the same thing anyway. Maybe we'll talk about that. Many thoughtful openings take advantage of both sight and sound to like accomplish some stuff. Totally, they do. EyePatchNotes says some opening buildcraft questions. What do the characters communicate by facial expression and body language? How are the characters arranged relative to each other? Is there a visual hierarchy by size? Or are appearances scheduled, like ordered in the opening in a deliberate way? What are the instruments and vocals, if any, doing to match or contrast what's being shown on the screen? EyePatch Branded Media Density Analysis is a series now, that's true. Sponsored by Workahol Shadow Legends. Not sponsored, I would not take that sponsorship. Up to bat are some choice anime openings circa 10 odd years ago. We're going to be talking about Gun X Sword, EyePatchNotes says not recommended, and Kami-sama Dolls, also not recommended apparently. I haven't seen either. EyePatchNotes says light spoilers ahead, though some clever techniques address this, and I think the way I'm going to do this parlay, I think I'm obscuring all spoilers. And we incorporating them into the video, we're not going to watch the whole thing of both of them. But I took a quick breeze over them at the beginning. I have a lot to say about this topic already, so forgive me for focusing on the things that I have the most to say about. But Gun X Sword first. A blue wave silhouette is used to dramatically reveal the characters and art underneath. So basically, like, characters are often obscured when they show up by like blue. They're just in silhouette. They're blue. And that goes away as the show goes on. In the early version provided here, many of those waves never go away during the opening's runtime. But the idea is that over the season of the anime, this opening is slightly modified every couple episodes to show characters that we've then met. A lot of anime openings will kind of marathon the cast, and this one obscures them, but then gradually reveals them as we meet them during the show. It's an artistic decision to mask story elements the viewer hasn't seen yet. Characters will have their blue waves recede as the show goes on, and some characters turn fully black to represent their deaths in the narrative. Right. Another cool way you can do it. Or like sometimes that part's just removed, which I think is kind of brutal in some other shows. Inspecting this mostly blue version of the opening, there's already a few trends to note. A flute plays prominently when introducing the two known leads, plus a turtle. What is this show? and 4 more silhouettes. The opening then pivots to a percussion and vocal segment with a purple background instead of just blue, probably our villain segment by the shift in visual and audio cues. While it's standard fare for openings to have these whirlwind character introductions, the act of hiding characters for later is a rare treat. As a brief aside, I also think that this thing you suggested, that the music will in some way also kind of foreshadow or be like a pathetic fallacy for what's being shown, is also uncommon in my opinion. I'm certainly familiar with that happening, but in my experience, I sure haven't seen that very many times, but certainly before. Moving on, EyePatch says, Kami-sama Dolls has a lot more going on visually, starting with an apparent contrast between the countryside and the city. Like Gun X Sword, silhouettes are used to cover characters the viewer has not met yet. One character is even looking away from the viewer and will eventually turn around to show their face. That's a little extra effort, nice. However, an added layer of interest is scrutinizing the silhouette used. While most of the silhouettes are randomly patterned, slight markings will indicate which of the characters are mecha pilots / stand users. What are these shows? I have something to say about that later too. Speaking of mecha pilots, our resident Shinji stand-in, yes, it must be an Evangelion-like show, his name is Kyohei, is consistently shown to be contemplating or even anguishing in time with the vocalized Yamete Kure. Japanese translation is like a mild to strong version of stop it. Also, despite lacking the silhouette of a stand user, the chorus showcases Kyohei with a mecha. With sufficient context, the Kami-sama Dolls opening is very much a compressed version of Kyohei. I'm going to reveal the spoiler. Yeah, basically the story of the show. But I'll avoid spoiling that part. EyePatchNotes concludes, while these evolving style openings can result in like 6 variations by the series end, EyePatchNotes will always appreciate creative choreography. Here's that Blu-ray version of the Gun Sword opening, which again, I don't think we'll have time for. There's a lot in this parlay already. I want to focus on what I've got to say about. Kind of 3 main things I can think of. The first one is discussing the many other forms of utility that an opening might have, digging a little bit more into ways I can think of that other shows have explored the uses you mentioned, like introducing the cast a certain way, maybe some regular trends there. And weird, there are some anime openings that are way off the beaten path, and maybe thinking about what those might do, because they don't obviously do the character introduction thing, or what I said about like demonstrating something that is ambiance for the show, at least not directly. And so I want to get into that. And the characters being arranged relative to each other, that whole thing, the whirlwind introduction of characters, I want to talk about that. So we'll talk about that a little bit. Then I wanted to talk about the silhouette thing, the whole, just that. I'll leave it at that. I have a bad habit of summarizing, but then I just do the whole topic right then, so I'll try not to. And then as a third thing, how many different anime openings the show has. So that's 3 things we're going to do, like talking about all the utility an opening might have, the silhouette topic, and then more variants of an opening, rather than like a new one every season or every 12 episodes or whatever. Because I find it quite interesting when shows don't do that, simply because it is the form. The audience doesn't expect a new opening more often than that, or like differences in openings, so it's always extra. It's a choice when that is not done. It's always interesting when looking at authorship in any form. What would the non-choice be? They still made the choice to do the normal thing, but it's the least of a choice, I think. What if they did something choicey? Let's say it that way. Why? Like what? Huh? And a lot of the time that means more work too. So there was a cost. Why did they feel like it was worth it in this case? Or did they always do that? You know, I think that's cool. Right. So starting with all the utility that an opening might provide. My whole ambiance thing is really about openings that are very animated. The interesting thing about anime openings to me from a budgeting perspective is that you're going to see it at the beginning of every show. But personally, I've found that it's a mixed bag whether or not the show takes that as a chance to make it look good or takes it as a chance to make it look bad. I'm not sure I fully understand why they would do the latter, but it happens a lot. I've often found shows where the opening is like one of the better looking parts of the show, or where it's like really not. Usually it doesn't look ugly. If they're not going to make it look good, they use some kind of shortcut. There's a lot of graphics or effects or editing or cutting or something, or it's like a lot of footage from the show, which for me personally is the biggest turn off. And it's interesting to consider how that may or may not achieve various goals. For example, if your anime opening is going to go for low budget, again, I think this is just a mistake, but a lot of them do, and it's going to use footage from the show, well, that's not easily going to accomplish this detail I mentioned about demonstrating the everyday life of the characters or some ambiance, like adding to the narrative indirectly, because it's only going to show things that happen in the show. You might have like one slice of life episode. A common format is that shows will do mini arcs of 3 to 4 episodes, and then there'll be like a kind of cool down episode where we introduce the next thing. And so you could emphasize those scenes to make it feel like the show has more of that in it than there is, or to remind the watcher that that's the characters are living daily lives, you know. This makes me think of like school anime where you don't actually go through the process of going to class and stuff, but the show might do something to remind you that that is still happening to them visually. You know, they'll talk about it, but having the end or the beginning of the show them like in class a little bit might be effective. So it's probably more effective. I wonder if it's more common if you're not going to use new footage for your opening, to use footage of the characters in the show in order and to kind of foreshadow things that are going to happen later. Something I've seen in a surprising place to find this, One Piece. In no spoilers for One Piece. I'm not. Don't worry. I'm like past episode 1,000, so I'm not going to spoil it. Don't worry. There's an interesting moment where two characters that you wouldn't expect to aid Luffy directly aid him directly, but not in the same context. Like the animation is literally the same animation that will be used many dozens of episodes later, but not in the same context. It's just kind of floating in space for thematic purposes, that he's being kind of like lifted up by the people around him to suggest that. But then in the show, there's a moment in the show where that actually physically happens for like a much more down to earth or pragmatic reason. I thought that was odd. I was really surprised when I saw it. It's also got a quite different tone. Like it's much more, I would say the one in the opening is quite lighthearted. It's a pretty lighthearted opening, I would argue. The music is, I would describe it as a little bit gentle. It builds hype in some ways, and it introduces One Piece's rather large cast again, or, you know, we get to see each of them. Because a big thing about this arc, not all arcs of One Piece have all the characters on the main crew, but this one does. And so we kind of highlight that a little. And I'm not going to talk more about this part of One Piece, but anyway, it evokes a lot of that. This opening does a lot more to focus on the tone of that arc of One Piece, but I found it interesting how we are depicting these two characters as aiding our protagonist in a way that they will, but not with the same tone as it looks like they do in the opening. I thought that was odd. And personally, I think this is something that openings often do badly, or maybe I'm just an idiot. Sometimes I see characters arrayed a certain way, and it suggests something about them that isn't true in the show. Like it makes it look like they're going to be a certain way that I'm then waiting for, which the show then does not deliver on. It's dangerous to do something like introducing two characters as juxtaposed. They're doing the back-to-back thing or something. I don't know. But then they're not in the show. Like that's just the villain. It's not really someone who's going to be much of a foil to our hero or whatever, but it looks, they're using the iconography that shows where that is true use when they do it, you know. This transitions a little bit into the silhouette topic. I think it's interesting to note how a lot of shows will rely on the fact that you're expecting things to go a certain way because you've seen shows do the silhouette thing before, to upchuck that somehow. There's a whole tradition, and personally I've experienced this more in anime than in other forms of media, where the show uses framing or marketing or both or a lot of things to try to fool the viewer into thinking that there's a trope they know, but actually it's something else. The canonical example is Maho Shoujo Madoka Magica. And again, I won't say more about that. It might still work for many folks who've not been, I guess you could say, spoiled on the themes of that show. But there was a lot of marketing and a lot of framing done in that show to make it appear a certain way that I think is really interesting. That relies on the fact that the magical girl genre exists. If it didn't, this would not work. But because it does, it for a lot of people at the time it worked. Even things as simple as actually in Mahou Shoujo Madoka Magica, the person who worked on it, some of the staff members have certain, I'm just going to say, reputations, which made people who are familiar with those people think, wait, why is he making a show that appears to be like this? And then there's a little glimmer of, like, what are you up to, kind of thing. You can then use extremely subtle foreshadowing in the show to cause a rather strong reaction from the audience because they're paying attention for that thing. A bad anime opening could do the opposite, could be priming someone to look for something that maybe isn't there or won't be shown that way. What I was getting at with the silhouettes is that when you create characters like that, you have the opportunity to make characters that look similar show up, but then not be the character they saw in the opening. And the viewer has a lot of assumptions, maybe. They were watching the opening and thinking, oh, I wonder if that character is going to be like that. Or it's a franchise, and they're thinking, is that this character that I know from other works in this franchise? But you're not sure, and maybe the series kind of upends that. Or they're depicted in a way that you didn't expect. Particularly common maybe for characters who change status throughout the show, who are not always in the same position. I just think that's interesting. It can be difficult when a character has a sort of a fall, like you mentioned, the characters getting blacked out silhouettes when they die. A thing that I find I haven't seen done well very often is when a character is an ally to our heroes, but then stops being an ally. This is, I think, often just not done well, period. But in the few cases where I felt like I understand why this happened, that character is often simply cut from depiction in the opening, rather than their status changing in some way. And it would be a really minor, but I think great touch if that did happen. Oftentimes, where this could be really useful is if people who make anime openings take notes. This is what I want, okay? I'm ordering a new trend in anime. When shows do a thing where a very meaningful plot development occurs like right at the end of a show or something, where you might miss it or you might not remember it as easily, highlighting that a little bit by depicting some development in the opening is, I think, really, really useful. We're going to get into that a little bit more in the final section about more openings, basically. Obviously, there's a cost to that. I think some types of shows, it becomes kind of necessary if you do things a certain way. You can't really have only one opening if the show is going to upchuck its tone or stakes or framing so much, which is maybe why they often change between seasons, sure. But getting to change that more often would be nice for some narratives, and it might require a new opening. I do think the opening kind of locks the tone of the show in some ways. And my thesis about an anime opening being the entire show creates the point that when you have one thing that people see basically at the beginning of every episode, the tone of that thing, like how consistent is this show going to be, if it's going to change over time, maybe that doesn't work as well. I do find it elegant then that a lot of shows go for a simpler approach. They go for mostly being a character roster for the show and focus on introducing the new characters. So maybe you don't focus as much. I feel like that revealing takes away from the rest of the opening. I find myself often focusing on what changed. I notice that one change and kind of forget a lot of the rest. That might take emphasis off of the rest of the opening, so it doesn't affect the tone as much when you get to the show. Something that I have brought up a lot in Parley, because it was a big part of my life. The culmination of my college studies in the English department as a creative writer was to use things from works I really liked, to use the general technique in my own work without literally just copying it. And one of the pieces I read was Haruki Murakami's Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World. This book has alternating chapters. Every odd chapter is, Hard-Boiled Wonderland, and every even-numbered chapter is The End of the World, or or whatever. That's how it works. And they're very different aesthetically, and what happens is that reading one right before the other, like having a taste in your mouth when you eat another food, affects in some implaceable way how you interpret each other chapter, causing the rather down to earth narrative to be affected by the abstract narrative, and vice versa. I think that's obviously it does a little bit more than that, but I don't want to spoil the book for you because I liked it and I think you should read it. Anyway, if that sounds cool to you. I think a very literary gimmick book would make a great book to read as part of a class, in my opinion. Not in a bad way, because it's interesting and fun, but also does some like obvious and then increasingly less obvious things with its narrative device. I thought that was really cool. For every moment since I read that book and did my capstone project related to that technique, I've been thinking about how you bring things in to any piece of media you consume, but a lot of pieces of media do something to deliberately harness that effect. And again, I think these anime openings, there's a big example of that. Personally, I think that a lot of shows don't use that the same way. I'm going to use Game of Thrones as an example. A lot of you have seen Game of Thrones, and you're immediately thinking of the that whole thing, and the like weird clockwork animation structure thing they did. If you haven't seen the opening to Game of Thrones, it doesn't really have any spoilers. It's a more abstract type of opening for a show. Just go watch it. It's cool. The music is nice. The visual effect is weird, unique. You're not going to get like spoiled or anything, really, at least not in my opinion. It's just locations from the show, really. But yeah, that's a good example of something that on the surface you might be thinking, isn't that also giving you it's adding something to the ambiance of the show off camera by showing you like there's this political situation. The Game of Thrones is a very map show. There's a place, and here's all these places, and that's important to the show. Yeah, true. Although characters teleport all over the place all the time, from a narrative perspective, they do cheat with that a lot. But anyway, but I don't think that opening does something that similar to what these anime openings are doing. It's really just, in my opinion, evoking sensory memories, or really just memories in general of Game of Thrones is long, very long. And so it brings those things back to the surface without directly demonstrating any of them. It does often, as the seasons go by, we're shown these interesting depictions that you should go look, these clockwork structure building animations of the settings we are currently focused on. Sure. And that does do something similar to setting some ambiance or reminding us of where we are relative to the other parts of the world. Sure, but it doesn't change much, and I think it's much more meant to be, EyePatchNotes, what you said at the very beginning, kind of gently allowing everyone to get situated for a live broadcast in a way that I feel like a lot of anime openings aren't as much in at least my culture, where they're very rarely watched live. They're generally watched after the fact, and a lot of anime websites even include the ability to automatically skip the intro. I believe they are quite often skipped. Something really interesting about this whole topic is to consider how much you can use techniques that include the opening if it becomes normal to skip the opening. That's something that you can do things about in a show. I wanted to talk about like the structure of a show overall, and how you can, add more openings to a show or change the opening more often without the audience missing that thing to have some effect. I have a couple of examples, but yeah, I hope this is an interesting way to tackle these topics. I just think it's interesting how this sort of character roster thing is a little unique to anime, in my opinion. There are definitely live action shows. I'm thinking of like CSI or whatever, where they introduce all, you see a person from the cast and their actor's name and they're playing this character or whatever. Sure, and that's kind of similar, but those shows are often like episodic, or that there's not going to be reveals in there a lot of the time anyway. Whereas a lot of these anime openings are, it's the exact opposite. They're all about that progression of reveals, or you frequently don't meet all the characters right away, or know everything about them, as it were. Changing character designs and introducing characters gradually is something that I think is obviously not unique to anime, but it is something that is much more common in anime than other types of media. And anime openings of the type you're discussing, EyePatchNotes, are designed almost entirely around that. I would agree. I think that's a good way to reference that. Um, yeah, so I wanted to give a couple examples of shows that I think have like an interesting way of using anime openings, some interesting problems, just like more discussion points about how they can depict characters and the ambiance of a show. The two examples I'm going to use are Roku no Yusha, Braves of the Six Flowers, and The Melancholy of Suzumiya Haruhi. Two shows with which you may or may not be familiar, but both of which I don't know if I recommend. Since you mentioned EyePatchNotes that you don't recommend Gun X Sword and Kami-sama Dolls, I'll say, yeah, I liked these two shows, but I'm not sure I would. They're only a light recommendation. It's not that I thought they were bad; they were just weird. Roku no Yusha first. The premise of this show is that there's a, big danger thing, whatever, in this fantasy world. And there is supposed to be 6 heroes that will rise to do the thing. I'm trying to avoid spoilers here, so this is a very high level pitch. And they're going to be marked with like a flower petal thing on their hand to show that they're one of the titular Braves of the Six Flowers. This show has 2 openings in its only, I think, 12 episode runtime. About halfway through, we swap, and they're pretty different. Like they're rather different, because the show, you think the show's gonna zig and it zags. I'm gonna leave it at that. The tone of the show, or the sort of the point of the show, changes enough that you really can't have the same opening anymore. And if you had the second opening from the beginning, it would be blatantly obvious that the show was gonna be like this. Everything from obviously what is shown in the second opening to the music just sounds like the show is blatantly not about what it's gonna be about. This is sometimes done, like sometimes you get these weird opera, like very melancholy sounding, very orchestral sounding openings for a show that is like a gritty shonen action show or whatever, as a form of contrast, to varying degrees. But anyway, suffice to say, if you watch the show, I think you'll see what I mean. It's a show where the structure of the show, it's almost like they kind of needed to make 2 openings. There really wouldn't be any way to not heinously spoil the entire show, but if you depicted literally anything about the show in the opening. I can't really think of any way. Yeah. You could obscure parts of a character's character design, for example, without spoiling much of the show. I said that their little Brave of the Six Flowers mark, that's on their hand. They could not show their hands. If you watch the show, you'll see that in the second opening, they do the exact opposite of that. But anyway, I think that's an interesting approach. The silhouettes can be used in different ways. It doesn't always have to be a silhouette. The idea of the character turning around or having more of a part in the show is something that is iconic to me. That's something I can think of more examples of. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure often features the characters like popping off and interrupting the opening as the series gets toward the end, which I think is a really cool iteration of that. But I don't have much else to say about that example. I just think it's interesting how the structure of some shows makes it would be very difficult to have the same opening all the way through because of a shift that's going to take place in the middle. By contrast, something like Mahou Shoujo Madoka Magica, where, yeah, there's a big shift during the show, but it's a different kind of shift. Like, it's more of like an events are this way or that way kind of shift, rather than it's not even a tonal shift in Roku no Yusha. It's like the entire point of the thing we're doing has completely changed. Like, our goal is not even the same. So any type of action that happened in the first half of the show being depicted in any way in the second half of the show would arguably not make sense. I can't, without spoiling it, I can't explain why. But the way the characters act is something that fundamentally is incongruous with the second half of the show. And I think that's interesting. I don't know if there's a lot of shows like that. In fact, I struggle to think of many shows where I feel like you literally couldn't come up with any opening that depicted the show in any meaningful way that you wouldn't then have to change. But there are shows that take an abstract approach. I said you can't depict anything from the show that would be relevant when the show changes halfway through. Well, you could have an opening that doesn't depict anything from the show, basically. The currently airing Summertime Rendering has the first opening anyway, for the first season, the first 12 episodes or so, doesn't really depict the show in anything but the absolute most abstract way, with a very melancholy song that I think does evoke the atmosphere of the show, but depicts essentially nothing from the show. I don't know how to feel. I feel like from an atmospheric perspective, from a pathetic fallacy perspective, if this is the soundtrack and the pictograph to this world, maybe that's good. But it's pretty much completely removed from the type of opening that you're talking about, EyePatchNotes, where we show the characters one after another. Now, Summertime Rendering, this isn't a spoiler at all, is a show that involves death. This is known from the first minute of the show. And so one reason that was done is that they don't want you to know which characters might like live and die or whatever. And I guess they didn't want to do the thing where they show the characters and then they, black out their silhouette or something. I think it goes further than that. I think that show doesn't even want you to know which characters even are the focus characters. And the reason is that they don't want you to know which characters have plot armor. That's what I think anyway. Later on in Summertime Rendering, there will become less of a need for this because of a bunch of spoilers that I can't tell you. And so there's a much more traditional opening after the first part of the show ends, which I thought was kind of interesting. Again, it's at a regular cadence for this show. They don't have to do extra openings per se. But I thought it was interesting how they kind of had to not do a roster of characters because it isn't a show that is depicting a set group of people at first. It's depicting the population of a whole island. And to show you specific characters in the opening, even if they were silhouetted out, would be to say the show is about these characters, which would be a fairly major spoiler for at least one character who doesn't appear to be a particularly major part of the plot, but surprisingly is after quite a few episodes. If they were even in the opening, that would in some way spoil their relevance to the story. But then once that was revealed, it would feel weird if they weren't in the opening because like the entire story is about them. So it's interesting how the silhouette model of obscuring a character and then blacking them out, I think kind of wouldn't work. Even worse, this character is actually a very specific size too. So if you saw someone that was that stature in the opening, you would think, what? It like must be this one character, or the show would be forced to put a bunch of other people that look like them in. I just think that's like weird and an interesting problem. It's fascinating to me. Yeah, so my last example is The Melancholy of Suzumiya Haruhi. This is a show that has fairly nebulous arcs. It has, kind of the small to medium size arcs, maybe with some cooldown or transition between them, like I mentioned earlier. So 4 to 8 episodes, I guess, a lot of the time, which makes them movie-like. In fact, at the end, there is a movie. 4 to 8 episodes being 80 minutes to double that in length. So it's kind of like a bunch of movies. You could release it that way, they just didn't. Or maybe they did later, but anyway, originally they didn't. And a lot of the time, the openings change between those arcs instead of at any other regular time, which is important because they are significant shifts in what's going on. Again, it would be kind of irrelevant if you showed events not from one arc during another. In particular, if you've watched The Melancholy of Suzumiya Haruhi, there's one arc that is 8 episodes long, and I'm not going to say anything else about it so I can avoid spoilers, but if you've watched the show, you can see what I mean when I say if you showed anything not from that arc during that arc as the opening, it would be pretty weird. Like, that would just be confusing. In fact, I don't even remember if that one has an opening. Anyway, but I have kind of a better example now that I've brought this up, of a show that does this more and makes the final point I wanted to make, which is about where you put the opening. I said that oftentimes anime openings are skipped in my culture anyway. And so using techniques that utilize an opening can be risky because the viewer might skip them. The person watching the show might get used to it always being at the very beginning and then skip it. If it isn't at the beginning, but it isn't new content or it doesn't feel relevant to the show, it can be really frustrating because you don't know how to skip it regularly, but you're not gaining anything new by watching it, you don't feel. And if you're marathoning the show, this can become quite an annoyance, or sometimes you'll skip a little too far and you don't actually know if you missed content or not. It can lead to frustration. So, all in all, during the digital age, I think it's better to either one, keep your opening at the same spot, or two, if the opening is going to change frequently or be very relevant to the ambiance of the show, which will have to be a judgment call that people will make wrong all the time, but fine, it would be good to not put it at the same regular spot and to maybe find a good narrative beat to use it on. A show that does this very well, I think, is the Monogatari franchise. In the Monogatari series, there's often these little arcs. They're often even smaller and less regular. 2 or 3, 4 episodes, it kind of depends, with different characters, introducing the characters pretty slowly for a show like this. So the very first arc is Hitagi Crab, and it's 2 episodes, if I remember correctly, and it introduces us to our main characters, I would say, Aradagi and Hitagi, and it's about her. Hitagi has this thing going on with her, and we're going to tackle this thing, and that's what the first part is about. To obscure spoilers as much as possible, if you watch like 10 minutes of it, you'll see what I mean. And I thought that show was interesting. I'm not sure I recommend this one either. I think you'll know if you're gonna like it pretty quickly. So this is one where I would say just go ahead and watch it. It's not gonna like trick you or something. If you watch the first episode, the whole show is like that. So if that sounds like something you'd like, there you go, and you'll know. Whereas some of my other ones, I don't even know if you liked it by watching the beginning. So that's why I was hesitant to recommend them. Anyway, the Monogatari thing. Bake Monogatari, the first part, which starts with that Hitagi Crab arc, which is 2 episodes, well, they all have their own openings, and they're very, very thematic to that arc. They don't really depict anything from the show or necessarily introduce the characters to varying degrees. They're often like very abstract, like relationships to the show, but they do a lot of work to kind of frame the character of that part of the show. To set the mood a little bit. They are, maybe you would say, character notes for the character that is the focus of that arc. And all of the Monogatari parts are kind of loosely structured around the narrative device that they're focused on one of the characters. They do repeat sometimes. So sometimes it'll be like another Araragi focused arc or another Hitagi focused arc. It's not like they only have one each, although some of them do. But the character upon whom it's focused generally has some abstraction. Hitagi has a relationship with staplers. I know that's really weird, but the opening has a bunch of friggin' staplers in it, which on the surface might seem really random, but when you watch it, you'll feel like, oh, that's because of this, and a little bit more abstractly because of this other thing that's going on with her. I'll give you a hint. It has to do with crabs. Gross. Anyway, and I think that is a really interesting middle ground. It feels like a narrative beat. If they're traveling somewhere during the arc, the show can then stop and have the opening play there. And it feels like there is time passing, so having there be an opening there is kind of immersive in that way. And it does depict the place they're in, a bit abstractly, a little bit like the Game of Thrones example I gave. But it avoids spoiling anything the way that, like, maybe openings that depict the characters more straightforwardly would, while also giving you a bit of a teaser. You know, kind of the unsung hero of the anime opening technique is that you can get people excited for the characters later on. When you show a silhouette of a character that's going to be the big bad, you ensure the viewer that this is a show where that is a thing that happens, you know? Likewise, if you see some extremely random seeming artifact in the Monogatari openings, Well, but you watched the Hitagi crab arc at the beginning. You know that it isn't actually random. It's actually related in a way that after you finish the arc, you'll feel like, oh yeah, obviously, that's why that was in there. That's why there were staplers flying all over the place. Because it's related to this thing that I understand now that I've watched it. So when in the next arc, there's this weird detail and you're like, what is even, why? Why would that be there? You have faith now that that is something that you will understand later, which creates some foreshadowing, which can be really fun. Again, I think trying to figure out if a show is going to be a slice of life kind of show, or a show that's going to have some kind of big bad in them or whatever. Not that slice of life shows can't have that. By depicting there as being some kind of villain, even in silhouette, during the opening, is a good technique. You might have a show where you can't really depict any single figure, but you can still foreshadow that there will be something to find out later. I think this is deceptively important as a way to kind of close up. Anime openings as entire anime is my little subtitle for this parlay, because I think a lot of the time there's a good pacing moment in a show that isn't good if the audience isn't given some reassurance that this matters, basically, or like in what context it matters. And giving the audience an idea of what kind of show the show is good. Like if you're a person who makes any media, that like you should do this. Like it's very, very good to do this. Imagine if you made a video game update and you just told the player, this is why we put this in the game. This is our intention, or what we want you to think is our intention. That's obviously very valuable. It's not done as often as it should be, although I feel like it is done more nowadays. We've talked in the past, in previous parlay, about how there's this thought about how long a show might take to get good. And I think if you're even asking that, the show has kind of screwed up. It's not invalid to have framing, to have some time to build exposition or introduce characters or whatever needs to be done, but I don't really think you need to leave the audience wondering about that stuff. I don't really see how that's necessary. I feel like you can use the opening to show that. Even just showing that there will be these characters later gives the audience something to look forward to. In an ensemble cast type show, kind of like what Gun X Sword and Kami-sama Dolls look like from the openings, it looks to me like these are shows where you're going to meet characters one after another. And if I don't like a character in one arc, well, I know from just the very beginning of the show, from a mere 90 seconds, that there will be another character after this that I might enjoy more. That's a good idea. Now, I often don't like those kinds of shows in the first place. I don't want to have to go through a character I dislike. I hate it when an ensemble cast is burdened with a character that I simply find annoying. I would sort of rather take characters in their turn rather than having everyone always be there. And I think it's wise when shows do that to varying degrees. Again, I think One Piece and the Monogatari franchise are both good examples of doing this in various ways to various degrees. But my point, I guess, is that when thinking about, I almost feel like how long it takes for a show to feel like it gets good is kind of beside the point, because it would be better if the show used its opening to assuage that concern somehow. Rapid fire list of examples. Summertime Rendering is a show that really hits the ground running, and although there's a mystery right at the beginning of the show, you do find out information extremely fast. The show maintains an air that you are going to continue to be beguiled by elements of the show while setting expectations accordingly that this is going to move pretty quickly, like there's going to be reveals quite often, by having an opening that is mysterious, you could say. I think that's some of what it does for me. Getting so much information right at the beginning of the show, but then the opening is just this impenetrable, oblique piece of abstract art is like, what? And it does also do something in its very final moments. If you watch Summertime Rendering, you'll know the very first episode what I'm talking about. At the very ending of the opening, they show something that I would almost say works as a content warning, although maybe it could have been more of a warning, because the show will feature a lot of that topic later, but you wouldn't know it for the first few episodes, that's like gonna be a recurring thing. That's interesting. So again, there was really no need for the show to not demonstrate both of those things as long as it used its resources appropriately. Likewise, reassuring the viewer that we're going to move from character to character, or doing the I guess like the One Piece thing, like these are the characters in this arc. Remember, these characters are here. When people are doing 10 different things and the crew has gotten as big as it is, you like the reminder that, like, oh yeah, that character's here. And I remember what they're doing. I don't think it's hard to remember what they're doing, but it might slip your mind after week, month after month, if there's like a bunch of different stuff going on at once. That's a good example of that. Um, Having a show that teases the silhouettes of the characters and then introduces them one after the other can be interesting, but also troublesome. There might be shows where merely demonstrating which characters are even in the show, Roku no Yusha, maybe Summertime Rendering, could itself be a bit of a problem. Showing too much about the character design is almost the point of the show. There's something about the characters that you shouldn't even know who is relevant to the show or see every part of them. Just looking at a 3D model of a character would in some ways spoil the entire show, which I think is an interesting place to be for a show like this, for these. Not being able to even show the audience the characters that the entire show is about is a challenge. And finally, I do think that the way the Monogatari franchise does it is interesting. A lot of those openings stick in my mind because they set a thematic tone for that part of the show. They made me think about the character in their own weird way. They made me associate things with the character for a long time. Monogatari also has kind of normal character designs, and you can do a lot to kind of add to a character design by framing them in a certain way during the opening. I think Shinji and Kyohei are good examples of this, from Evangelion and Kami-sama Dolls, that opening. That's who that character is, right? I was a little confused about which one was which there. Whatever show Kyohei's from, that character you're referring to, the guy with the mecha, I'm mixing them up in my head now. And Shinji from Evangelion, they're kind of milquetoast characters. Like, their character design itself is, in my opinion, not taking a lot of risks, but it's added to by, well, I guess like the mecha and the suit and stuff. But that's an example too. But also by the way they're depicted in the opening. You kind of attach that to them somehow. So I think that's another kind of unsung hero. As usual in Parley, I have good ideas toward the end, and I think that's a big thing that you could discuss more. It'd be interesting to analyze a bunch of image examples of that. It would be hard, but for an anime-focused channel that wanted to talk about character design, it'd be cool to look at like a bunch of examples of characters where their design is simple, but the way they're shown in the opening like kind of annexes their design in some way. That could be cool. All these milquetoast protagonists are blurring together. So with that, I hope that was a satisfying discussion about anime openings. Again, I went a little bit off the beaten path of these examples. I hope that was okay. I sort of used them as a springing off point. I hope that was all right, interpreting this in a more open-ended way. I felt like you said what there was to say about these examples, but I thought they were good examples. Indeed, there's the example of the iconic silhouettes. The Gun X sword opening is a very explicit example of that is done in lots of shows. So yeah, I thought it was cool, good. I hope you enjoyed the way I chose to tackle this topic.